Hello, and welcome to my tutorial on how to play chess. In this video, I'll be covering beginner to intermediate tactics that you can use to win your games. But firstly, what even is chess? Chess is a board game played on an 8 by 8 square where one player controlling the white pieces and another player controlling the black pieces tries to put the other player's king in checkmate, something I'll be covering later on in the video. The chessboard is composed of 8 ranks labeled 1 through 8 accordingly. And the first rank begins here. The last rank begins here. There are 8 files as well. Files are vertical lines you can draw just like this. And they begin, the first one labeled A begins here. The last one labeled H begins here. But first, before I can move on to the tactics, I have to show you how the pieces even move. The first piece I'll be covering is the foundation of chess, and it is the weakest piece on the board. It's called the pawn. The pawn can only move forward. It can move 2 squares forward so long as it is on its starting square. This pawn starts the game on d2, and since it is still on d2, it can move to d4. It also has the option to move to d3. This pawn, its starting square was e2. It has moved off of e2 to e3. Because of this, it cannot move 2 squares forward to e5. It can only move to e4. Pawns, however, even though they can't move diagonally, they can take other pieces diagonally. So if this pawn were to move to e5, white could capture it. However, because they can only move forward and take diagonally, they cannot move diagonally and take going forward. This pawn is frozen solid. It cannot move forward and take this pawn because it's being blocked. And it cannot move diagonally to f6 or d6. The next piece I'll be covering is a knight. The knight is considered to be the most complicated piece, strictly based on how it moves and acts. The knight can move in an L-shaped pattern like this. For example, this knight can move to any of these 8 squares. However, besides that, the knight also has the special ability to jump over other pieces. For example, this knight has been barricaded in by its own pawns. However, it can easily just jump out. It's not blocked in by any of the pawns. It also does not matter whether the knight is blocked in by an opponent's piece or by your piece. For example, this knight is blocked in by a bunch of opponent pawns. However, the knight jump out. The third piece I'll be covering is the bishop. The bishop can move diagonally as far as it wants in any direction. However, because of this, the bishop is strictly able to go to one color. For example, I have 2 bishops here, one white, one black. This is what's called a light squared bishop. This is called a dark squared bishop. The light squared bishop is called the light squared bishop because it can only move on light squares. It will never, throughout the entire course of the game, go onto a dark square. The dark squared bishop is named the same for the same reason. It can never go onto a light square. Because of this, these 2 bishops interact in an interesting way where they will never be able to see each other no matter how close they get. These bishops will never be able to interact. The fourth piece I'll be covering is the rook. The rook can move horizontally and vertically in any direction. Because of this, the rook is stronger than the bishop because it can actually defend different colored squares. For example, these rooks, despite being on 2 different colors, can both defend and attack the f7 square. Because of this, unlike the bishop, rooks that are starting on two different colors can interact with each other. For example, this rook can go to c3. The two rooks can see each other. The second to last piece I'll be covering is the queen. The queen is the strongest piece on the board. The queen has the powers of the rook and the bishop combined, allowing it to move in any direction as far as it wants. This makes the queen very strong when attacking. The final, most important piece in chess is the king. The king can move in one square in any direction. The king is so important that if the king is under attack, the player with the king under attack must respond immediately. For example, in this position, the black rook attacks the white king on c4 through the file. White has a bishop and a rook. However, because the king is under attack, the king must respond. I can't move this rook, I move this bishop, so I must move my king. This is called a check. The king is so important, in fact, that you can't even endanger the king. For example, this king is covering these squares. My king can move to any of these squares. However, since this king is covering these three squares, I cannot move there because it will be endangering my own king, and I must move to any of these 5 squares. A game of chess is won when one player places another player's king in checkmate. Checkmate is defined as a king having no squares he can safely move to while being in check. For example, in this position, rook to h1 is checkmate. This is because the queen cuts off this file, the king can move to there safely. The rook places the king in check. Because of this, the king has nowhere it can go safely and it is in check. Therefore, the black king is in checkmate. There are 3 other checkmates in this position. Try to spot one of them. I'll give you some time. If you said queen h4, queen h5, or queen g7, then you're correct. All 3 of those are checkmates. And queen h4 or queen h5, just like moving the rook to h1, the rook cuts off this file, and the queen delivers a checkmate. This pattern is called ladder mate. It can be done with 2 rooks, where one rook cuts off the king's escape, another one delivers checkmate. Or it can be done with 2 queens, or a rook and a queen, doesn't matter, so long as the file is cut off and another piece gives a checkmate on that file next to it. If you had said queen g7, you're correct. This move gives a check to the king. The king cannot take the queen because the rook defends. The queen also covers the h7 and g8 squares while giving the king a check. This leads to checkmate. With each piece moving differently, obviously some are going to be worth more than others. For example, the pawn is worth 1 point. The knight is worth 3. The bishop is also sorry. The bishop is also worth 3, but it is considered more valuable than the knight. The rook is worth 5. The queen is worth 9. The king is worth 0. However, it is still the most important piece because if you lose it, you lose the game. Before we jump into the tactics, I'll need to cover a few special rules. The first one is castling. Castling can be done when the king and the rook have not moved from the starting square. For example, the rook on e1, or the king on e1, the rook on a1, and the rook on h1. Neither have moved from the starting squares, meaning I can castle. Castling is done by moving the king 2 squares in the direction of the rook and putting the rook on the opposite side of the king. For example, the king moved 2 squares in the direction of the rook, so towards the right, and the rook went to the opposite side of the king. This is called short castling. Long castling is castling this way. As I said, the king moved 2 squares in the direction of the rook, and the rook went on the other side of the king. Something to note about castling is you cannot castle if it will place your rook or your king in danger. For example, in this position, I cannot short castle because this rook covers the f1 square. If I were to castle, the rook would be on f1, thus endangering my rook. This rook covers the c1 square. That means I cannot long castle because I would be moving my king to c1. You also cannot castle out of check. For example, in this position, I am in check. This bishop is attacking my king. I can neither short castle nor can I long castle. There are 3 and only 3 ways of getting out of check. The first one is simply moving the king. You can see the rook is attacking the king, and you have danger. The next one is blocking. You can see I'm in check. I block the check with my rook. The final one is simply taking the attacking piece. The rook is attacking my king, but the bishop is attacking the rook. I can just take the rook. The last thing I'll be the last thing I'll be covering before going on to the tactics are 2 special pawn rules. The first one is called en passant. En passant occurs when a pawn is on the 5th rank, and another pawn moves 2 squares on either side of it. En passant allows me to take as if this pawn is on the c6 square, even though it's on the c5 square, like this. I can only play en passant if it is the first turn my opponent plays it. So, for example, they put pawn to c5, with my king, my opponent moves their king. I can no longer capture en passant because it has been more than a turn since they moved their pawn. The second pawn rule is promotion. When a pawn reaches the end of the board, so for white, that will be the 8th rank, and for black, that will be the 1st rank, it can turn into any piece that is not a pawn or a king. So I reach the end of the board, and I have the option to promote to either a queen, a knight, a rook, or a bishop. I'm going to pick the queen, and now my pawn has turned into a queen. Now that I've gone over all of the rules, I'll now be going over some strategies. The first strategy that I'll be going over is the opening phase. The opening phase is the most important part of chess as it dictates who is better in the middle game and the end game. The opening phase can be broken down into 5 steps or tactics. The first one is to control the center. This can be done best by using the D pawn or the E pawn. Let's say I put a pawn to D4. I'm controlling these 2 squares, and black typically will respond with pawn to D5, controlling these 2 squares. Now that we have a bit of center control each, we now want to go on to the second step of developing out the minor pieces. Minor pieces are defined as knights and bishops. So let's say I play bishop to f4, controlling center space, as well as placing pressure on the c7 pawn. White may respond with knight f6, putting an extra defender on the d5 pawn, as well as controlling space in the center on the e4 square. I play knight to f3, controlling center space and placing an extra defender on this pawn. Black plays bishop to f4, placing pressure on my c2 square as well as controlling space. This is a symmetrical position, which is pretty common in the opening, as we each control the same amount of space in the center. Say I play pawn to e3, strengthening my center, as well as creating space for me to move this bishop outwards in order to castle. Black responds with pawn to e6 with a similar idea of moving out space, or moving the bishop out, as well as controlling more space. I move the bishop to e2, and black takes the opportunity to play what's called a pawn break. A pawn break is a move that excuse me. A pawn break is a move that is played to open up the center. Here, black is attacking my d pawn with their c pawn in the hopes that I will take, they can take back, controlling the center with their bishop. Now, let's say white doesn't do this. They want to keep their center closed. They may play something like pawn to c3, then after takes, now that they have played pawn to c3, they can take back the e pawn, and now c pawn defends the e pawn, strengthening their center. After black finishes their development, white finishes their development of the knight, controlling more center space, and now they move on to the next step in the opening phase, king safety. King safety can be broken down into, how safe the king is. It can be defined by how many pieces are attacking the king and how open the king is. The best way to get to king safety, or the best way to get your king to safety, is by castling. In this position, both players can castle, so black castles short and white castles short. The final step of the development phase is to connect your major pieces. These are your rooks, your queen. Let's say black plays knight to d7, taking up center space, and white responds with queen to b3, attacking this pawn as well as taking up some center space. This now connects the rooks on the first rank, and let's say black also responds with the same thing, keeping the position symmetrical as well as connecting their own rooks. This concludes the opening phase. The next tactic is spotting hanging pieces. Hanging pieces are pieces defined as just having no defenders. They're just entirely by themselves, and if they were to be attacked and didn't move or become protected, they'd be free to take. An example of a hanging piece is in this position. Let's say white plays e3. This is a terrible move because it hangs the rook. The rook has no defenders, and this rook can freely take. Can you spot the hanging piece in this position? I'll give you a few seconds to look for it. If you spotted the knight on d6 was hanging, you'd be correct. Now, obviously, you can hang your own pieces. In this position, the knight on e4 is hanging. Can you spot a way to get the knight out of danger or put a protector on the knight? If you suggested moving the knight to any of these squares, you'd be correct. But if you also suggested moving this knight to d2, you'd also be correct, as this knight now defends this knight from the bishop. And if the bishop were to take, it would be an even trade. The second tactic I'll be going over are pins. Pins are when a piece of lower value is placed in front of a piece of higher value. And when the piece of lower value is attacked, it cannot move because you will take the piece of higher value behind it. An example of a pin is if white moves e4 with the idea of attacking the d5 pawn. However, behind the knight is the king. If you play rook e8, the knight cannot move because behind the knight is the king. White cannot capture the pawn, and white has to move the king because, once again, the knight cannot move. No matter where the king moves to, will capture the knight on e4 and promote the pawn. Here, black thinks that this is a free pawn. So they go ahead and they take. However, what black missed was the pin on h5. The bishop moves h5. Behind the queen is the king. Here, black is pinning the knight to the queen. White might panic here, but you can simply block the pin. Now, the knight is no longer pinned to the queen and can move to somewhere like d2. The bishop will now be attacking this bishop. Try to spot the game-winning pin here. I'll wait a little bit so you can find your answer. If you said rook to f1, you would be correct. Behind the queen is the king. After queen takes, rook takes, black is simply up a rook and will promote these pawns and win the game. The next tactic I'll be covering is skewers. Skewers are kind of like the reverse of a pin, whereas a pin is attacking a piece of lower value and behind it is a piece of higher value. Sorry. A skewer is attacking a piece of higher value and behind it is a piece of lower value. For example, here, black has a game-winning move, queen e8, attacking the king, and behind the king is the queen. The king is more important than the queen. The king moves, and the queen takes the queen. This is a common endgame pattern in which black is to win. White makes the mistake of playing rook a1, attacking his pawn. Now it looks like black cannot promote, as if black were to move the rook, well, they cannot promote, the rook would take. And the pawn cannot push to promote because the rook is blocking it. However, black has to move rook to h8. Now, if white were to capture the pawn on h7, the rook can go to h7, skewering the rook to the king. White makes the mistake of shortcutting here. Can you spot the game-winning skewer? I'll give you a few seconds to find it. If you said bishop to e5, you'd be correct. The bishop hits the queen must move somewhere, and behind the queen is the rook. The next tactic I'll be covering are forks. Forks are when you attack two or more pieces at the same time. In this position, white can play knight e3, check, giving an attack on the king and the queen at the same time. Because the king is more important than the queen, it must get out of check. After the king moves, white takes the queen and will likely promote one of these pawns to win the game. Here, I was showing you a common chess trap called the fried liver that uses a fork in the opening. White opens up with e4, black responds with e5. Bishop. Sorry. Excuse me. Black responds with c5. White plays the knight to f3, attacking the e5 pawn, and black defends it with knight c6, defending the e5 pawn. White plays this, and if black is careless and tries to copy white, white can now hop the knight into e5, the queen cannot take because the knight is defended by the bishop on c1. The bishop and the knight line up on this pawn on f7, and if white or black's not paying attention and they play something like f6, the knight can now jump in onto f7, which now is attacking the queen and the rook at the same time. The king cannot take because the bishop defends, so after the queen moves and white takes the rook, white is simply winning. Try to spot the fork here. I'll give you a few seconds to find it. If you said rook d8, you'd be correct. This attacks the queen and the king at the same time. The queen must take. And white sorry. And white is simply winning here. The next tactic I'll be going over is discover check. Let's say white takes his pawn and black's king is stuck in the center of the board. Black should really just castle short and get their king to safety. However, black is hungry and decides to take the pawn on b2. Now, white can play the move knight c4. This looks like a free knight. However, because the king is in check, because the knight moved to open up the rook, this knight cannot be taken. Black must do something about the king being in check. And so they move. And now that the king is no longer in check, white can take the queen on b2. Try to spot the discovered check here. I'll give you a few seconds to find it. If you said bishop h7, you'd be correct. This opens up the queen to see the queen. And the king either ignores the bishop or takes the bishop. Doesn't really matter. No matter what the king does, you take the queen on the next turn. The next tactic I'll be going over is deflection. Deflection is forcing a piece off of another piece's defense. For example, if white were to simply trade queens here, black has 3 pawns versus 1 bishop, and it will be very difficult for white to stop black from promoting at least one of these pawns. However, white has the deflection tactic, bishop g5. The bishop is attacking the king, skewering the queen through the king. This forces the king to take, and white can take the queen with check, and this is a winning endgame. Can you spot the deflection tactic here? Give you a few seconds. If you said rook e1, you'd be correct. This check forces the king off the defense of the rook. This king blocks out these squares, so the king cannot move to the right. The rook blocks out these squares, so the king cannot move up or down, meaning the king must move to the left. And when the king moves to the left, you take the rook. Now I'll be going over some basic checkmate patterns. The first one is back rank mate. Back rank mate is, well, doing a checkmate on the back rank, obviously, where the king is blockaded in by its own pawns, allowing a rook or queen to drop down to the back rank, delivering checkmate. The king cannot escape upwards because it is blocked in by its own pawns, and cannot move here or here because the rook also covers those squares while attacking the king. A way to abuse back rank mate is like this. White notices that if they were to take this rook, black cannot take back, as then rook d8 is back rank mate. If white plays that, and black, not paying attention, takes the bishop, and white delivers checkmate. Here, white is at the threat of being back rank mated. Excuse me. White cannot bring any pieces to their back rank prevents the checkmate and cannot block the rook from delivering. Checkmate. If white were to try to get to the back rank, black is simply faster. So white can create what's called a luff. A luff is a pawn move that allows breathing. Sorry. That allows breathing room for the king. For example, here. Now black gives us checkmate, or not checkmate, it's check. King can now go up, and black has no more threats, and white is simply up a rook and 2 pawns. This tactic is called dovetail mate. Dovetail mate is when you put your queen, or when the king blocked him by 2 pieces, like this, and the queen can deliver checkmate right here. The king cannot move to here or here because it is blocked in by the pawns. The queen covers all of these squares and uses the power of the bishop and the rook to get checkmate. It doesn't really matter what piece is defending the queen. Here I chose to use the bishop. See if you can spot the dovetail mate. I'll give you a few seconds. If you said queen to a8, you'd be correct. Despite black having a scary attack going in onto the back rank, white's checkmate is quicker, and you get dovetail mate. Final checkmate pattern is called smothered mate. Sorry. Here, white can give a check with the knight. The king has no squares it can go to, and no piece can take the knight. So the king must move to d8. Here, though, white can play the move knight 6. This gives a check with the knight and check with the queen. Because the queen is giving a check, this pawn cannot take the knight. If the king moves to here, a checkmate on f7. If the king moves back to h8, white can sacrifice the queen. The king cannot take the queen because the knight is defending. The rook has to take the queen. When the rook takes the queen, it is checkmate on f7. So 2 essential checkmate patterns to know. It's how to checkmate with king and queen, and how to checkmate with king and rook. Here, I'm up a queen. My opponent has nothing but a king. All I have is a queen and a king. The first step to checkmating with the queen and king is create an L shape, kind of like a knight. You want to go to here. This forces the black king to here, here, or here. No matter where the black king goes, you will remain with an L shape. The black king goes here, you'll go up with him. The black king goes down, you'll go down with him. The black king goes here, you go down there with him. No matter where the black king goes, you follow until you get the black king to the edge of the board. The black king has no option to drop downwards. Let's follow. The black king drop down again. Do not follow. If you follow, it will be stalemate. The black king has nowhere to go, and the game is a draw. What you must do is bring your king. The black king has to go up. The black king will shuffle between these 2 moves as you bring your king over. Now, deliver checkmate on g2. Checkmating with king and rook is a bit more difficult. Here, you want to push the king to the edge of the board. This can be done by cutting off the king. The king can now no longer make progress this way. The king will likely attack your rook, simply slide it down. The opponent will likely move the king in the direction of your rook. Kind of like a queen, you want to use your king to create kind of like an L shape, like this. What this does is if the king continues to move closer to your rook, you will give a check. Your king blocks off these squares, and this king is forced to move closer to the edge of the board, like like this. You simply follow with your king, once again creating that L shape. And let's say this time, instead of moving closer, the king blocks off these squares. And once you deliver check with your rook, it is checkmate. The king cannot go up, and he's pinched on the edge of the board. So let's say he goes up. You simply follow with your king. Sorry. If the king ever moves back in the direction of your rook, you will once again deliver checkmate. So he goes up, can't drop back down, can't go up, and now he is forced to drop back down, and it is checkmate. A massive endgame tactic and how most endgames end is passed pawns. Passed pawns are pawns that can move without the interference of any rival pawns. For example, if there was a pawn here on b7, this would not be a passed pawn, because if this pawn were to make its way to a6, it would be fighting against another pawn. However, there is no pawn on b7, meaning this pawn is free to walk down the board. Because of this, black cannot stop from promoting, and this is just winning for white. Here, white can use the threat of a passed pawn in order to make the king's way to these pawns. Sorry. For example, white plays king to e4. If black tries to follow with king d6, white can now play b5. This pawn will make its way without any problems. The king is forced to turn back. Now, white has 2 pawns and will promote and win the game. Here, white uses the similar tactic to the last puzzle and plays pawn to g4. If black takes, white has created a passed pawn. King must defend against this. And now white will promote. Sorry. If black ignores, white will simply push. And once again, the king must come to stop the passed pawn. And now white will once again promote and win the game. Sorry. Will promote and win the game. The second to last tactic I'll be covering is forced promotion. In this position, black can do nothing to stop white from promoting queen. After black takes, white takes. This is simply winning for white. Here, there's a winning tactic where you drop down to back rank and give a check to the king while hitting the rook at the same time. You move to just take the rook. And if the rook takes, you promote to the queen. Here, no matter how strong the rook is, he cannot stop one of the pawns from promoting to pawn d7. The rook takes, you take back. Sorry. Black cannot stop promotion. If the rook moves away, you promote to a queen. And you can still promote even if he takes the pawn. The final tactic I'll be covering is Zugzwang. Zugzwang is where you force your opponent to play a bad move. In this position, white recognizes that he can play king 5. Here, this pawn covers this square, the king covers this square. This leaves black with only these squares to go to. No matter which square the black king goes to, the white king will take the pawn. Black will not stop promotion. That concludes my chess tutorial. Thank you for watching.